What's up, history enthusiasts? Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and underrated stories of World War II. We're talking about a tank that was already considered outdated in Europe, a tank that the British were phasing out, a tank that should have been a footnote in history. Instead, it became an absolute nightmare for the Japanese Imperial Army in the Pacific Theater. I'm talking about the Matilda II infantry tank. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why Japanese soldiers called encounters with this beast absolutely terrifying and why their anti-tank crews must have felt like they were shooting spitballs at a fortress. So buckle up, because we're about to explore how an obsolete British tank became a jungle juggernaut, a legend that turned the tide of battles in the Pacific, and a steel monster that Japanese guns literally could not penetrate, even at point-blank range. Let's get into it. How an obsolete British tank became a jungle juggernaut. Here's the thing about the Matilda II. By 1942, it was already yesterday's news in North Africa and Europe. The Germans had figured out how to deal with it. Their 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns could punch through its armor, and the newer Panzer models were making Matilda look slow and cumbersome, which, to be fair, absolutely was. The British were already transitioning to more modern tanks like the Churchill and the American-supplied Shermans. The Matilda was being retired, phased out, sent to the back of the garage like your dad's old sedan that still technically runs, but nobody wants to drive anymore. But here's where the story gets interesting. The British and Australians fighting in the Pacific Theater had a problem. They needed tanks, and they needed them fast. The Japanese were advancing through Southeast Asia and New Guinea like a wildfire. The Allies were desperate for armored support that could handle the brutal jungle terrain, the mud, the rivers, and most importantly, the Japanese defenses. So someone had the bright idea, hey, we got all these Matildas sitting around collecting dust. Why don't we ship them to the Pacific? And just like that, the Matilda got a second chance at life. Except this time, it wasn't facing German 88s and Tiger tanks. It was facing an enemy with fundamentally different equipment, different tactics, and here's the kicker, anti-tank weapons that were woefully inadequate for dealing with heavy armor. The Matilda arrived in the Pacific in 1942, and it didn't take long for everyone to realize something incredible. This obsolete tank was basically invincible against Japanese weapons. We're talking about a tank that Japanese anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate from any angle, at any range. A tank that could roll right up to enemy bunkers and sit there, taking hit after hit, while calmly demolishing Japanese positions. In the jungles of New Guinea, Bougainville, and Borneo, the Matilda wasn't obsolete. It was a god of war, and the Japanese had absolutely no answer for it. Design secrets. Why Japanese guns couldn't scratch the Matilda. Alright, let's talk about what made the Matilda such an absolute unit. And I mean that literally, this thing was built like a brick outhouse wrapped in more bricks. The Matilda II was designed as an infantry tank, which in British doctrine meant one thing above all else. Armor, armor, and more armor. Speed? Who needs it? Firepower? Sure, that's nice. But armor? That was the whole point. The Matilda had a maximum armor thickness of 78mm on the front, and even the sides had respectable protection. Now, that might not sound like much compared to later war tanks, but remember, armor isn't just about thickness. It's about angle, quality, and what you're up against. The Matilda's armor was well-sloped in key areas, made of quality British steel, and designed to stop the anti-tank weapons of the late 1930s and early 1940s. Against German guns in 1942? Yeah, it was getting outclassed. But against Japanese anti-tank weapons? It might as well have been made of adamantium. Let's talk about what the Japanese were working with. Their standard anti-tank gun was the Type 147mm, which could penetrate about 55mm of armor at 500 meters under ideal conditions. The Matilda laughed at this. Literally, the crew inside probably couldn't even feel the impact half the time. The Japanese also had the earlier Type 94 37mm anti-tank gun, which was even more useless. This thing was designed to deal with light Chinese tanks and early 1930s armor. Against a Matilda, you'd have better luck throwing rocks. Even the Japanese Type 97 Chiha medium tank, their most common armored vehicle, was armed with a 57mm gun that couldn't reliably penetrate the Matilda from the front. Japanese tankers must have felt like they brought a knife to a gunfight. Actually, scratch that. More like they brought a butter knife to a tank battle. But it wasn't just the armor thickness. The Matilda was also mechanically reliable by Pacific theater standards. It could ford rivers and streams, and its tracks handle mud better than you'd expect for such a heavy vehicle. It weighed about 27 tons, which made it slower than molasses going uphill. Top speed was maybe 15 miles per hour on a good day, but in the close quarters jungle fighting, speed didn't matter nearly as much as survivability and firepower. Speaking of firepower, the Matilda mounted a 2-pounder gun initially, which was later upgraded to the better 3-inch howitzer on some Australian variants. The 2-pounder was excellent against Japanese tanks and light vehicles, and the high-explosive rounds were devastating against infantry positions and bunkers. So you had this perfect storm, a tank designed to be nearly invulnerable to 1930s anti-tank weapons, facing an army still using 1930s anti-tank weapons in terrain where its weaknesses, mainly its slow speed, didn't matter, and where its strengths, thick armor and reliable operation, were exactly what was needed. The Japanese design philosophy had focused on lighter, faster tanks suitable for infantry support and exploitation in China. They never anticipated facing heavy armor in the Pacific. Why would they? The jungle terrain, the lack of roads, the logistical nightmare of shipping heavy tanks across the ocean, none of it suggested that heavy tanks would be a factor. And then the Matilda showed up. Oops. First battles in the Pacific. Shock, panic, and broken cannons. Imagine you're a Japanese soldier dug into a fortified position in the New Guinea jungle. You've got machine guns, mortars, and a 47mm anti-tank gun that your commanders have assured you can stop any Allied tank. You've seen action against light American tanks and some Australian universal carriers. And yeah, your gun can handle those just fine. Then through the jungle, you hear it, the grinding, clanking sound of tracks. Then you see it, a massive, angular shape pushing through the vegetation. It's bigger than anything you've seen before, and it's heading straight for your position. Your anti-tank crew immediately opens fire. Direct hit. The shell bounces off like a ping-pong ball. They fire again, and again, and again. The tank doesn't even slow down. In fact, it's rotating its turret toward your position now. This was the reality of the Matilda's first engagements in the Pacific, and the psychological impact was devastating. One of the earliest major uses of Matildas in the Pacific was during the Battle of Bunagana in late 1942 and early 1943. Australian forces were struggling to break through heavily fortified Japanese positions in eastern New Guinea. The terrain was a nightmare: swamps, jungle, and well-prepared bunkers that were nearly impossible to assault with infantry alone. When the Matildas arrived, everything changed. These tanks could roll right up to Japanese bunkers, absorb everything the defenders could throw at them, and systematically destroy each position. Japanese soldiers reported being paralyzed with fear when they realized their weapons were completely ineffective. There are accounts of Japanese anti-tank crews firing entire magazines of ammunition at Matildas. We're talking 20, 30 rounds, without achieving a single penetration. At the end of these engagements, Matildas would return to base with their armor painted with impact marks like some kind of achievement badges. The crews would literally count the dents and laugh about it. One Australian Matilda crew reported taking over 40 direct hits from anti-tank guns and field artillery in a single engagement, and their tank was still operational at the end of the day. The biggest damage? Some scratch paint and a broken periscope. That's it. That's basically like getting your car keyed in a parking lot, except the keys were high-velocity armor-piercing shells. The Japanese response was predictable: panic, followed by desperate attempts to find anything that could stop these metal beasts. They tried concentrated anti-tank gunfire. Didn't work. They tried their own tanks in direct confrontations. That went even worse. They tried close-range attacks with magnetic mines and explosive charges, which had limited success but required suicidal bravery to execute. Japanese field reports from this period make for fascinating reading. Officers were frantically requesting better anti-tank weapons, heavier artillery, anything that could level the playing field. But the Japanese logistics network in the Pacific was already stretched to breaking point. Getting new weapons to the front lines was nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the Matildas just kept rolling forward. At the Battle of Saddleburg in November 1943, Matildas provided crucial support for Australian infantry assaulting heavily fortified positions. The tanks would advance under heavy fire, shrug off anti-tank rounds, and then blast bunkers at point-blank range with high-explosive shells. One particularly memorable engagement saw a single Matilda hold off a Japanese counterattack for over an hour, destroying multiple machine gun nests and an anti-tank gun position, while taking dozens of hits without suffering any significant damage. The crew reported that the inside of the tank sounded like being inside a bell tower during a thunderstorm from all the impacts, but they never even considered retreating. The psychological advantage cannot be overstated. Japanese infantry, already facing brutal conditions and Allied air superiority, now had to contend with the fact that their most fortified positions could be casually demolished by tanks they literally could not stop. That's not a fight. That's a massacre waiting to happen. And here's the dark comedy of it all. The Matilda was already considered obsolete. Back in Europe, tank crews were moving on to better, faster, more modern vehicles. But in the Pacific, the Matilda was the king of the jungle, and it knew it. Japanese countermeasures, mines, fire, and desperation. Of course, the Japanese weren't just going to lie down and accept their fate. They're nothing if not resourceful and terrifyingly determined. When conventional weapons failed, they got creative. And when creative didn't work, they got desperate. Let's start with the obvious solution: bigger guns. The problem was the Japanese didn't have many bigger guns available in the Pacific theater, and the ones they did have were needed for coastal defense and anti-ship roles. You can't just pull a massive artillery piece away from defending against potential amphibious landings to deal with tanks. But they tried. Japanese forces did deploy some heavier artillery pieces, 75 millimeters and even 105 millimeters guns, in anti-tank roles. These could, technically, damage or destroy Matilda. But here's the thing. These weren't mobile anti-tank guns. They were heavy, difficult to move, and once they fired and revealed their position, they became priority targets for Allied artillery and airstrikes. Plus, in the dense jungle terrain, setting up effective fields of fire for heavy guns was incredibly difficult. The Matildas could often get close enough to neutralize these positions before the guns could score a decisive hit. So the Japanese turned to more unconventional methods. Landmines became a favorite tactic. The Japanese would create elaborate minefields around defensive positions, hoping to immobilize or destroy Matildas before they could reach the main fortifications. This worked sometimes. The problem was that mine warfare requires resources. You need lots of mines properly laid with overlapping coverage. The Japanese logistics situation in the Pacific rarely allowed for that level of preparation. Also, Allied forces got wise to this pretty quickly. They'd use infantry scouts, engineer teams, and sometimes even tanks equipped with mine rollers to clear paths. It slowed down attacks, sure, but it didn't stop them. Then things got darker. Unable to stop the tanks conventionally, Japanese soldiers resorted to suicide attacks. Individual soldiers would charge at Matildas with magnetic mines, satchel charges, or even simple explosive packs, trying to get close enough to place the charge on the tank's exterior. This was as horrific as it sounds. These attacks occasionally succeeded in damaging or destroying a Matilda, but the cost was brutal. It takes a special kind of desperate courage or fanatical indoctrination to run at a tank that's actively shooting at you, knowing you probably have a few seconds to live at most. Allied tank crews developed countermeasures for this too. Infantry would screen the tanks, staying close enough to shoot down suicide attackers before they could reach the armor. Some Matildas had their hulls coated with concrete or additional plating to make magnetic mines less effective. Crews became hyper-vigilant about close-range threats, using machine guns to create a defensive perimeter of fire around their vehicles. The Japanese also experimented with fire as a weapon. In theory, if you can't penetrate a tank's armor, maybe you can cook the crew inside it. They tried Molotov cocktails, flamethrowers, and incendiary charges. Sometimes, if a Matilda got bogged down in difficult terrain, a coordinated fire attack could force the crew to abandon the vehicle. But again, this required getting dangerously close to a vehicle that was actively trying to kill you with machine gun fire and high explosive shells. Not exactly a high success strategy. One Japanese innovation was the use of concealed bunkers with heavy weapons placed specifically in positions where they could get flanking shots at passing tanks. The Matilda's side armor was thinner than its front, and a well-placed shot from a heavier gun could potentially achieve a penetration or at least cause enough damage to immobilize the tank. This worked better in theory than in practice. Matilda crews learned to move carefully, using infantry support to clear suspected positions, and coordinating with artillery to suppress potential ambush sites. The Japanese simply didn't have enough heavy weapons or favorable terrain to make this a consistent defense. Perhaps the most effective Japanese countermeasure was simply withdrawal. When Matildas showed up, Japanese commanders learned to pull back, avoid direct confrontation, and try to bog down the Allied advance with delaying actions rather than stand and fight defenses. This was smart tactically, but strategically devastating. It meant giving up territory and momentum, which in the Pacific Island hopping campaign was often a death sentence. By late 1943 and into 1944, Japanese field manuals were literally advising soldiers to avoid direct engagement with Matilda tanks when possible and to focus on isolating them from infantry support. That's the military equivalent of saying, yeah, we've got nothing. Good luck, try not to die. The desperation in Japanese accounts from this period is palpable. You can see the frustration in reports where officers describe hitting Matildas repeatedly with no effect, watching their best weapons bounce harmlessly off the armor, and realizing they had no good answer to this problem. It's almost enough to feel bad for them. But then you remember this is World War II. Context matters, and these were the people who definitely started this particular fight. So maybe the Matilda's invincibility was just a bit of cosmic justice served cold. Very cold, wrapped in 78 millimeters of British steel. Inside the beast, stories from Matilda crews. Let's talk about what it was actually like to crew one of these mechanical monsters. Because as impressive as the Matilda was from the outside, being inside one in the middle of the Pacific War was its own unique form of hell. First, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the oven. The Matilda was hot, and I don't mean uncomfortably warm. I mean surface of the sun hot. Remember, this tank was designed for European warfare, not tropical jungle combat. It had minimal ventilation, and when you're buttoned up inside with the hatches closed, operating in 90-degree heat with 100% humidity, the interior temperature could easily exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews would emerge from extended operations literally dripping with sweat, dehydrated, and sometimes suffering from heat exhaustion. They'd go through water faster than fuel. One Australian crewman described it as like being cooked alive in a metal can, except the can is also being shot at. The Matilda had a crew of 4: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Each had their own special flavor of suffering to endure. The driver sat in the front hull, with limited visibility and the lovely job of navigating through dense jungle, over logs, through rivers, and across terrain that would make a mountain goat think twice. Oh, and doing all this while people are shooting at you. The driver's compartment was cramped, hot, and when the tank was taking fire, you'd hear and feel every impact. Imagine driving a car where every pothole sounds like someone hitting the roof with a sledgehammer. That's what taking anti-tank fire felt like, even when it didn't penetrate. The commander sat in the turret with the best view of the battlefield, which was both a blessing and a curse. Blessing because you could actually see what was happening. Curse because you could actually see what was happening, including all the Japanese soldiers trying their best to kill you. Commanders would often fight with their hatch open for better visibility, which took a special kind of courage when bullets and shell fragments are flying everywhere. The gunner and loader worked in the turret alongside the commander. The gunner's job was to acquire targets and engage them with either the main gun or the coaxial machine gun. In jungle fighting, this often meant firing at barely visible bunkers, fleeting targets, and sometimes just suspected enemy positions. The loader's job was exactly what it sounds like: keep the gun fed with ammunition. This is exhausting work in any tank, but in a hot, cramped turret while taking fire? Absolutely brutal. But here's the thing about Matilda crews: they love their tanks. Yes, it was hot. Yes, it was slow. Yes, it was cramped and uncomfortable, and sometimes you'd come back from a mission looking like you just finished a marathon in a sauna. But you know what else? You come back. Matilda crews had incredible survival rates compared to crews of other tanks in other theaters. When you're in a vehicle that enemy weapons literally cannot penetrate, that changes everything. You can be aggressive, you can take risks, you can push forward into situations that would be suicidal in a less protected tank. One Australian Matilda commander, interviewed after the war, put it perfectly: "I'd rather be hot and alive than comfortable and dead." Every time we took hits and they bounced off, I said a little prayer of thanks to whoever designed that armor. There are some incredible stories from Matilda crews that really highlight the experience. One crew in New Guinea was advancing on a Japanese position when they drove over what turned out to be a camouflage bunker. The bunker collapsed under the weight of the tank, and the crew suddenly found themselves at a 45-degree angle, half stuck in a hole, with Japanese soldiers literally underneath them trying to climb out. The crew calmly reversed out of the hole, repositioned, and then systematically destroyed the position. The commander later joked that it was the most uncomfortable 30 seconds of my life, followed by the most satisfying 30 minutes. Another crew reported taking so many hits during a single engagement that they lost count after 50. When they returned to base, the maintenance crew spent an hour just mapping all the impact points. The tank was covered in dents and scrapes, like someone had attacked it with a very aggressive ball-peen hammer. The crew requested that the impact marks not be repaired because, and I quote, "We earned those scars." There's a story from Bougainville where a Matilda crew ran out of main gun ammunition during an extended engagement but continued to advance anyway, using just their machine guns to suppress Japanese positions while Allied infantry moved up. When asked later why they didn't withdraw to rearm, the commander said, "Because we knew they couldn't hurt us and we could still contribute with the machine guns. Plus, watching them waste ammunition on us was honestly pretty funny." The camaraderie among Matilda crews was intense. These were small teams living in extremely close quarters under extremely stressful conditions. They had to trust each other completely. The driver trusted the commander to give good directions. The gunner trusted the loader to keep ammunition flowing. Everyone trusted everyone else to stay calm under fire. And they had to stay calm under fire. A lot of fire. One crew reported that after a particularly intense engagement, they realized they'd been taking hits so consistently that it had basically become white noise. The constant banging and clanging was just the soundtrack to their day. Maintenance crews also deserve credit. Keeping Matildas operational in the Pacific was a nightmare. The heat, humidity, mud, and constant use took a toll on mechanical systems. Engines needed constant maintenance, tracks wore out faster than expected, and the tropical environment was hell on any kind of metal component. But the maintenance teams worked miracles, keeping the tanks running even under the most challenging conditions. One mechanic described the Matilda as a temperamental workhorse, cranky, stubborn, needed constant attention, but if you treated it right, it would never let you down. That sounds about right. By late 1944, Matilda crews had developed a well-earned reputation for being absolute badasses. They'd roll up to Japanese positions with a confidence that bordered on arrogance because they knew that the enemy couldn't touch them. That kind of psychological advantage is worth its weight in gold. In the end, the Matilda crews in the Pacific Theater wrote their own legend, separate from the tank's earlier reputation in Europe. They took an obsolete vehicle and turned it into a symbol of invincibility, a mechanical monster that the Japanese came to fear and respect. And yeah, they were hot, sweaty, uncomfortable, and cramped the whole time. But they'd do it all again in a heartbeat, because as one veteran put it, the Matilda might not have been the fastest tank, or the most modern, or the most comfortable, but it brought me home, every single time, and that's all that really mattered. David versus Goliath. Matilda versus Japanese tanks and at guns. Alright, let's talk about some straight-up David versus Goliath matchups. Except in this version, David brought a slingshot to fight Goliath, and Goliath is wrapped in impenetrable armor and carrying a very large gun. Spoiler alert, this doesn't go well for David. The reality of tank versus tank combat in the Pacific Theater was hilariously one-sided when the Matilda was involved. The Japanese simply didn't have anything in their armored inventory that could go toe-to-toe with the Matilda and expect to win. Let's break down the main Japanese tanks that the Matilda encountered. The Type 95 Hago light tank was the most common Japanese tank in the Pacific. It weighed about 7.5 tons, had a crew of 3, and was armed with a 37mm main gun. Its armor was, let's be generous and call it optimistic. Maximum thickness was about 12mm. Yes, you read that right. 12mm. When a Type 95 encountered a Matilda, the best strategy was to run away very fast. The Matilda's 2-pounder gun could penetrate the Type 95 from any angle, at any range. Meanwhile, the Type 95's 37mm gun could not penetrate the Matilda from any angle, at any range. This is what we call a bad day at the office for the Japanese crew. There are accounts of Type 95 scoring direct hits on Matildas, seeing the shell bounce off harmlessly, and then getting immediately destroyed by return fire. The entire engagement would last maybe 30 seconds, most of which was the Matilda crew acquiring the target. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank was slightly more formidable. At 15 tons, with a 57mm gun and up to 25mm of armor, it was the closest thing the Japanese had to a real tank by early war standards. Against Chinese forces and light Allied vehicles, it was reasonably effective. Against a Matilda, still hopelessly outclassed. The Type 97's 57mm gun could, theoretically, penetrate about 45mm of armor at close range under ideal conditions. The Matilda had 78mm on the front. Do the math. It doesn't work. Japanese crews quickly learned that engaging a Matilda head-on was suicide. Some tried to flank and get side shots, which had slightly better penetration chances but still required getting dangerously close and hitting a specific angle. The problem was, while the Type 97 crew was maneuvering for that perfect flanking shot, the Matilda would simply rotate its turret and blow them to pieces. The Matilda's gun could penetrate the Type 97 from any angle at combat ranges. There's a recorded engagement from Tarakan where 3 Type 97s attempted to ambush a pair of Matildas. The Japanese tanks opened fire first, achieving several hits. None penetrated. The Matildas calmly returned fire and destroyed all 3 Type 97s within 2 minutes. The Matildas didn't even bother moving from their positions. They just sat there, took the hits, and methodically eliminated the threats. The Japanese did produce a few upgraded Type 97 seconds later in the war with better guns. But by then, Matilda encounters were becoming less common as the front lines shifted and newer Allied tanks arrived. The Type 89 Igo was an even older design, basically a World War I tank with slightly better armor. Against the Matilda, it was target practice. End of story. But let's also talk about Japanese anti-tank guns, because this is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean tragically one-sided. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank was slightly more formidable. At 15 tons, with a 57mm gun and up to 25mm of armor, it was the closest thing the Japanese had to a real tank by early war standards. Against Chinese forces and light Allied vehicles, it was reasonably effective. Against a Matilda, still hopelessly outclassed. The Type 97's 57mm gun could, theoretically, penetrate about 45mm of armor at close range under ideal conditions. The Matilda had 78mm on the front. Do the math. It doesn't work. Japanese crews quickly learned that engaging a Matilda head-on was suicide. Some tried to flank and get side shots, which had slightly better penetration chances but still required getting dangerously close and hitting a specific angle. The problem was, while the Type 97 crew was maneuvering for that perfect flanking shot, the Matilda would simply rotate its turret and blow them to pieces. The Matilda's gun could penetrate the Type 97 from any angle at combat ranges. There's a recorded engagement from Tarakan where 3 Type 97s attempted to ambush a pair of Matildas. The Japanese tanks opened fire first, achieving several hits. None penetrated. The Matildas calmly returned fire and destroyed all 3 Type 97s within 2 minutes. The Matildas didn't even bother moving from their positions. They just sat there, took the hits, and methodically eliminated the threats. The Japanese did produce a few upgraded Type 97 seconds later in the war with better guns. But by then, Matilda encounters were becoming less common as the front lines shifted and newer Allied tanks arrived. The Type 89 Igo was an even older design, basically a World War I tank with slightly better armor. Against the Matilda, it was target practice. End of story. But let's also talk about Japanese anti-tank guns, because this is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean tragically one-sided. The Japanese did occasionally deploy heavier weapons, 75mm field guns, 105mm howitzers, and direct-fire anti-tank roles. These could hurt a Matilda, but they were rare, difficult to position effectively in jungle terrain, and once they revealed their position by firing, they became immediate targets for Allied artillery and airstrikes. Plus, these weren't mobile anti-tank guns. You couldn't quickly reposition them. Once a Matilda knew where you were, you had maybe 1 or 2 shots before you were getting hit with high explosive shells or simply overrun. The tactical situation this created was fascinating. Japanese commanders had to completely rethink their defensive strategies when Matildas were in play. Traditional anti-tank defenses didn't work. Frontal assaults by their own armor were suicide. Even ambushes had limited effectiveness. Some Japanese units tried to create tank traps, natural or constructed obstacles that would channel enemy armor into kill zones. But this required extensive preparation, favorable terrain, and often worked only once before the Allies figured it out and adapted. By mid-1943, Japanese tactical manuals were basically advising units to avoid tank versus tank engagements when possible and to focus on infantry-based anti-tank tactics like close assault with explosives. That's the doctrinal equivalent of saying, our tanks can't beat their tanks, so let's try not to fight their tanks. There's a certain bitter irony here. The Japanese had started the war with some tactical and strategic advantages in the Pacific. Better jungle warfare training, lighter and more mobile forces, extensive fortifications. But in armor, they were outclassed from day one, and when something like the Matilda showed up, the gap became a chasm. One Japanese officer, captured after the war, described the Matilda as an iron oni, oni being a demon from Japanese folklore. He said that Japanese soldiers would hear the sound of Matilda tracks and feel a sense of dread, because they knew there was nothing they could do to stop it. That's a hell of a reputation. So yeah, David versus Goliath. Except in this case, Goliath is 40 feet tall, bulletproof, and David's slingshot is literally useless. Not exactly the underdog story we usually root for, but in the context of World War II in the Pacific, this imbalance probably saved Allied lives and shortened the war in that theater. And for the Matilda crews, they knew they were driving an invincible monster, and they absolutely reveled in it. Turning points when the Matilda decided the battle. All right, so we've established that the Matilda was basically an unstoppable steel fortress in the Pacific. But let's talk about specific moments. Actual battles where the presence of Matildas didn't just help the Allies, it fundamentally changed the outcome. We're talking about engagements where, without these tanks, the result could have been completely different. Let's start with the Battle of Bunagana, which I mentioned earlier. This wasn't just a battle where Matildas participated. This was a battle where Matildas turned a grinding stalemate into an Allied victory. By late 1942, Australian and American forces were stuck trying to break through heavily fortified Japanese positions around Buna and Gunna in Papua New Guinea. We're talking about bunkers built from coconut logs and earth, positioned in swamps and jungle, with interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese defenders were dug in deep, and frontal infantry assaults were getting absolutely chewed up. The Allies were losing men at an alarming rate, morale was dropping, and commanders were running out of ideas. The terrain was so bad that bringing in heavy artillery was nearly impossible. The jungle was so dense that air support could barely identify targets. It was a nightmare scenario. Then the Matildas arrived. And I want you to picture this. You're an Australian infantryman who's been trying to assault these bunkers for weeks. You've seen your mates get cut down by machine gun fire. You've watched every attack get repelled. You're exhausted, sick, and starting to think this position might actually be impregnable. And then you hear that deep, mechanical rumbling. Through the jungle comes this massive, angular shape, bigger than anything you've seen before. The Japanese immediately open fire with everything they've got. The tank doesn't even flinch. It just keeps coming. It rolls right up to the first bunker, absorbs a dozen anti-tank rounds like they're mosquito bites, and then puts a high-explosive shell through the firing slit at point-blank range. The bunker explodes. The Matilda moves to the next position. Rinse and repeat. Within days, positions that had held for weeks were collapsing. The Matildas would advance methodically, destroying bunkers one by one, while infantry follow behind, clearing out survivors and securing the ground. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't elegant, but it was devastatingly effective. One Australian officer described it as like having a personal battering ram that doesn't care about bullets. The Japanese defenders, who had been so confident in their fortifications, were suddenly facing an enemy that could casually demolish their strongest positions while taking zero casualties. The Battle of Bunagana turned into an Allied victory, and while infantry and artillery certainly played their part, the Matildas were the decisive factor that broke the stalemate. Let's jump forward to the Huon Peninsula Campaign in 1943. The Australians were pushing north through New Guinea, and they hit a nasty obstacle. The Japanese had fortified the town of Finschhafen with their usual efficiency, creating a defensive network that covered every approach. The initial assaults weren't going well. The terrain was brutal, steep hills, dense jungle, and the Japanese had positioned their defenses perfectly to channel any attack into kill zones. Australian casualties were mounting, and the advance was stalling. Enter the Matildas. Now, here's the thing about the Huon Peninsula. The terrain was so rough that conventional wisdom said heavy tanks couldn't operate there effectively. Too steep, too muddy, too many rivers and gullies. The Matildas proved conventional wisdom wrong. These tanks climbed hills that infantry were struggling with. They forded streams that looked impassable. They pushed through jungle that seemed impenetrable. And all the while, they were absorbing Japanese fire like it was a light rain shower. There's a specific engagement at Saddleburg that perfectly illustrates the Matilda's impact. The Australians needed to take a ridge that commanded the approaches to Finschhafen. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. Bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, the works. It was a strong position, and attacking it head-on seemed suicidal. The plan was to use Matildas to spearhead the assault. Now, remember, these tanks were slow. We're talking maybe 10 miles per hour on good roads, slower on rough terrain. The Japanese could see them coming from a mile away, and that didn't matter one bit. The Matildas advanced up the ridge with infantry close behind. Japanese anti-tank guns opened fire. Direct hits, multiple guns firing simultaneously. The tanks kept coming. They reached the first line of bunkers and simply drove over some of them, crushing the positions under 27 tons of British steel. The ones they couldn't drive over, they destroyed with point-blank cannon fire. One Matilda crew reported that they'd advanced to within 20 yards of an anti-tank gun position. The Japanese crew kept firing desperately, achieving at least a dozen hits. The Matilda's gunner calmly acquired the target and put a shell right into the gun position. The commander later said, "I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Then I remembered they'd been trying to kill us for the past 10 minutes." The ridge fell. Finschhafen fell shortly after. The entire Huon Peninsula campaign accelerated dramatically once the Matildas proved they could operate in terrain everyone thought was tank-proof. Now let's talk about the Atape-Wewak campaign in 1945. By this point in the war, the Japanese were on the defensive everywhere, but they were still capable of launching serious counterattacks. The Atape area in New Guinea saw one of the last major Japanese offensives in the theater. Japanese forces attempted to break through Australian lines in a desperate counterattack. They had numerical superiority in the attack sector, they had prepared the assault carefully, and they had the advantage of initiative. For a few hours, it looked like they might actually punch through. Then, the Matildas counterattacked, and this is where the psychological impact really showed. Japanese infantry, who'd been advancing with some success against Australian infantry positions, suddenly heard the sound of tank engines. And not just any tanks, they knew that sound. They knew what it meant. Witnesses reported that the Japanese advance basically evaporated. Units that had been pushing forward aggressively suddenly broke and ran. The sight of Matildas advancing toward them was enough to trigger a collapse. Some Japanese soldiers stood and fought, of course. Discipline and training held for many, but the momentum of the attack was completely broken. The Matildas rolled through the Japanese positions like a steel avalanche, destroying strong points and routing infantry. The counterattack turned into a disaster for the Japanese, with heavy casualties and a complete failure to achieve any objectives. One Australian commander noted in his report, "The enemy showed considerable determination until the tanks were committed. The appearance of the Matildas caused immediate and visible panic in enemy ranks." That's the kind of psychological edge that's worth more than any amount of armor plate. But let's talk about a smaller engagement that really encapsulates the Matilda's impact: the assault on the Japanese stronghold at Bonus on Bougainville in June 1945. The position was a nightmare. Bunkers built into hillsides, interconnected tunnels, overlapping fields of fire. Intelligence suggested it would take weeks to reduce, with heavy casualties expected. The Japanese defenders had nowhere to retreat to. They'd fight to the last man. The Australian attack plan was straightforward. Send in the Matildas first, let them break the defenses, then exploit with infantry. Simple, but it required the tanks to perform in extremely difficult terrain against a prepared enemy. 3 Matildas led the assault. The Japanese opened fire with everything: anti-tank guns, field artillery, even attempted close assaults with explosives. For over an hour, those 3 tanks absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter vehicles 10 times over. And then, methodically, systematically, they destroyed every single defensive position. The infantry following behind basically just had to mop up. The stronghold that was supposed to take weeks fell in a day. Australian casualties were minimal. The after-action report noted that all 3 Matildas returned to base under their own power, despite taking a combined total of over 80 anti-tank hits. One tank had its antenna shot off. That was the extent of the damage. That's the Matilda in the Pacific in a nutshell. Absolutely invincible, completely unstoppable, turning potential bloodbaths into manageable victories. There's one more engagement I want to highlight: the landing at Tarakan Island in May 1945. This was an amphibious assault, always risky, always costly. The Japanese had fortified the island extensively, and they knew the Allies were coming. The Matildas came ashore in the first wave, and yes, that's as difficult and dangerous as it sounds. Getting a 27-ton tank from a landing craft onto a hostile beach while under fire is not for the faint of heart. But they managed it, and once they were ashore, the battle turned decisively. Japanese positions that had been positioned to slaughter infantry landing on the beach suddenly found themselves facing tanks that their weapons couldn't hurt. The beachhead, which could have been a killing ground, became secure within hours instead of days. One American observer with the Australian forces wrote in his report, "I have never seen a more one-sided engagement. The Japanese fought bravely and skillfully, but they were trying to stop a force they were simply not equipped to handle. It was like watching someone try to fight a bulldozer with a garden hoe." That might be the most accurate description of Matilda combat in the Pacific ever written. The Japanese weren't incompetent. They weren't cowards. They weren't poorly trained. They were actually excellent soldiers facing a problem they had no solution for. And that's what made the Matilda a battle decider. It wasn't just that it was tough. Lots of tanks are tough. It was that in the specific context of the Pacific theater, against the specific weapons the Japanese had available, it was effectively invincible. And when one side has an invincible weapon and the other side doesn't, battles stop being contests and start being foregone conclusions. The turning points weren't just about the battles the Matilda won. They were about the battles that didn't have to be fought because Japanese commanders knew they couldn't win them. They were about the fortifications that were abandoned rather than defended because everyone knew what would happen when the Matildas showed up. By late 1944, the mere presence of Matildas in an area was enough to affect Japanese defensive planning. That's a level of battlefield dominance that's rare in military history. So yeah, the Matilda decided battles. Not through speed, not through firepower, not through advanced technology, but through being exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed. An unstoppable fortress on tracks that the enemy literally could not deal with. And honestly, that's about as decisive as you can get. The downside, the flaws that nearly undid a legend. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about how the Matilda was basically a rolling fortress of invincibility in the Pacific. And that's all true. But let's be real here, nothing's perfect, and the Matilda had some flaws that range from annoying to potentially catastrophic. Because here's the thing, being impervious to enemy fire is great, right up until your tank breaks down in the middle of the jungle and you're stuck. Or until you're so slow that you can't exploit a breakthrough. Or until the terrain that protected you from German tanks in Europe becomes your worst enemy in the Pacific. Let's start with the obvious one, speed, or rather, the complete lack of it. The Matilda's top speed was about 15 miles per hour on roads. On good roads, paved roads, in ideal conditions. In the jungle, on muddy tracks, uphill. You were lucky to get 5 to 8 miles per hour. There were times when infantry could literally keep pace with a Matilda on foot. I'm not exaggerating. There are accounts of soldiers jogging alongside the tanks during advances. Now, in defensive fighting or when assaulting fortified positions, this didn't matter much. You don't need speed when you're methodically destroying bunkers. But when you needed to exploit a breakthrough, pursue a retreating enemy, or respond quickly to a developing situation, the Matilda was about as helpful as a fast food restaurant at a marathon. There's a recorded instance from the Hainan Peninsula where Australian forces broke through Japanese lines and had a clear opportunity to pursue and possibly encircle a retreating unit. The Matildas were too slow to keep up. By the time they arrived, the Japanese had pulled back and established new defensive positions. The opportunity was lost. One Australian commander described the Matilda's speed as tactically embarrassing. That's British understatement for this damn tank moves like it's stuck in molasses. Then there's the gun. Now, don't get me wrong, the 2-pounder gun was perfectly adequate for the Pacific theater. It could destroy Japanese tanks, penetrate bunkers, and handle pretty much any target it encountered. But it was fundamentally an anti-tank gun, not an infantry support weapon. The problem was that in the Pacific, you weren't fighting masses of enemy tanks. You were fighting infantry in bunkers, fortified positions, and jungle hideouts. For that, you ideally want a gun that fires large, high-explosive shells. The 2-pounder fired relatively small shells that were great for penetrating armor, but less impressive for demolishing fortifications. The Australians partially solved this by mounting a 3-inch howitzer on some Matildas, creating the Matilda Hedgehog variant. This was much better for jungle fighting, bigger boom, better bunker-busting capability. But not all Matildas got this upgrade. One crew reported firing over a dozen 2-pounder rounds at a particularly stubborn bunker before finally destroying it. A tank with a proper high-explosive gun might have done it in 2 or 3 shots. The Matilda could win these engagements, but it sometimes took more ammunition and time than ideal. Now let's talk about the really serious flaw, mechanical reliability. Or rather, mechanical unreliability in tropical conditions. The Matilda was designed for European warfare. Temperate climates, relatively good roads, established supply lines. The Pacific was the exact opposite. Extreme heat, extreme humidity, terrible roads, if there were roads at all, and supply lines that were sketchy at best. The result? Matilda's broke down. A lot. The engine was particularly problematic. The twin AEC diesel engines were decent by British standards, but they were not happy in tropical conditions. Overheating was a constant problem. Dust and mud got into everything. Seals and gaskets deteriorated rapidly in the humidity. Maintenance intervals that were manageable in Europe became nightmares in New Guinea. There are accounts of entire Matilda units being reduced to 50% operational readiness simply due to mechanical failures. Not combat damage, just stuff breaking down because the environment was so harsh. Imagine being a tank crew and having a radio back to command. We're invincible against enemy fire, but we're currently stuck in mud up to the turret ring, and we're going to need some help here. Not exactly the glamorous tank warfare you signed up for. The limited fuel capacity was another problem. The Matilda had a range of about 160 miles on roads. In jungle terrain, with constant maneuvering, soft ground, and obstacles, cut that in half, maybe less. This meant that Matilda operations required extensive logistical support. Fuel trucks, supply dumps, careful planning of routes and objectives. You couldn't just send Matildas charging off into the jungle and expect them to operate independently for days. They needed constant resupply. In the fast-moving Pacific campaign, where supply lines were already stretched thin, this was a real constraint. There were times when Matilda units had to halt advances simply because they were running low on fuel and resupply couldn't reach them in time. The crew comfort issues I mentioned earlier weren't just about being uncomfortable. They affected combat effectiveness. Heat exhaustion is no joke. Crews operating in 120-degree heat for hours at a time would become sluggish. Some crews had to be rotated out simply because they were physically incapable of continuing. One commander noted that Matilda crews in extended operations needed more rest and recovery time in infantry, despite being in a safe, armored vehicle. The physical toll of operating in that environment was just that severe. The limited crew space also meant limited ammunition storage. A Matilda could carry a decent amount of main gun ammunition, but in prolonged engagements, crews could run dry. This happened multiple times, with tanks having to withdraw from combat simply because they'd fired all their shells. In one engagement at Bougainville, a Matilda crew reported firing every single round of main gun ammunition they had, over 80 shells, and then continuing to fight with just machine guns because withdrawing would have left infantry exposed. They made it work, but it was far from ideal. The communication equipment was also problematic. Radio reliability in the jungle was sketchy at best. Add in the electrical interference from the tank's own systems, the thick jungle vegetation blocking signals, and the constant moisture potentially damaging equipment, and you had a communication nightmare. Coordination between tanks and infantry was sometimes reduced to literally shouting at each other or using hand signals. Not exactly high-tech combined arms warfare. There are accounts of Matildas advancing on targets that infantry had already cleared or infantry waiting for tank support that had already moved on, simply because the radios weren't working. And here's a flaw that almost seems quaint now, but was serious at the time: visibility. Tank visibility is always limited, but the Matilda's vision ports and periscopes were designed for European warfare. In the dense Pacific jungle, crew situational awareness was severely compromised. Japanese soldiers learned to exploit this. They'd wait until a Matilda passed, then attack from behind or the sides where the crew had limited visibility. This is where infantry support became absolutely critical. Tanks needed infantry nearby to cover their blind spots. One crew reported being within 20 feet of a Japanese machine gun nest without realizing it was there until they started taking fire. The jungle was just that dense. They destroyed the position, but it was a stark reminder that invincible armor doesn't help if you can't see the enemy. The ventilation system, or lack thereof, wasn't just a comfort issue. Poor ventilation meant that gun smoke and engine fumes could build up inside the tank. After prolonged firing, the interior would be thick with smoke, making it hard to breathe and nearly impossible to see. Crews had to periodically open hatches just to clear the air, which exposed them to enemy fire. There's also the simple fact that the Matilda was a mechanically complex vehicle that required skilled maintenance crews and a steady supply of spare parts. In the Pacific theater, both were often in short supply. Parts had to be shipped halfway around the world, taking months to arrive. Skilled mechanics were worth their weight in gold and were spread thin across multiple units. This meant that tanks with relatively minor problems might be out of action for weeks, simply waiting for parts or qualified mechanics. In a theater where every tank mattered, this was a significant operational limitation. And let's talk about the elephant in the room. The Matilda was obsolete. Even in the Pacific, where it dominated, it was still a 1930s design fighting a 1940s war. As the war progressed and newer tanks became available, Shermans, Grants, even upgraded Churchills, the Matilda's limitations became more apparent. By 1945, commanders were actively requesting newer tanks to replace the Matildas. Not because the Matildas weren't effective, they still were, but because the operational limitations were becoming harder to overlook as the war moved into its final phases. The inability to keep pace with faster tanks like the Sherman meant that mixed tank units were limited by the slowest vehicle. The Matilda became an anchor on operational mobility. In a theater where the Allies were increasingly on the offensive, pushing forward rapidly, this was a real problem. There's a certain irony here. The same weight and armor that made the Matilda invincible also made it slow, maintenance-intensive, and logistically demanding. You couldn't have the good without the bad. It was a package deal. So did these flaws undermine the Matilda's legend? Almost. There were definitely times when commanders were pulling their hair out over broken-down Matildas, or cursing the tank's inability to exploit a breakthrough. But here's the thing. For all its flaws, the Matilda still did the job. It still saved lives. It still won battles. The flaws were real, they were significant, and they absolutely limited the Matilda's effectiveness in certain situations. But when you needed a tank that could walk up to enemy positions and absorb punishment that would destroy anything else, the Matilda delivered. One veteran put it perfectly. The Matilda was slow, it broke down constantly, it was a maintenance nightmare, and I'd trust my life to one again in a heartbeat. Because for all its problems, it kept me alive. And really, when you're in a war, that's what matters most. The flaws were there, they were serious, but they didn't undo the legend. They just made it more human. Or as human as a 27-ton steel monster can be, anyway. End of an era. How the jungle monster faded into history. So here's the thing about legends. They don't last forever. Eventually, the world moves on, technology advances, and even the most fearsome weapons of yesterday become museum pieces of today. The Matilda's reign as the terror of the Pacific was no exception. By early 1945, the writing was on the wall. The Matilda had done its job brilliantly, but the Pacific War was entering its final phase, and the operational requirements were changing. The Allies were advancing rapidly now. Island hopping, large-scale amphibious operations, breakthrough, and exploitation tactics. The war was becoming more mobile, and mobility was the one thing the Matilda could not do. Speed was becoming critical, and the Matilda's glacial pace was increasingly a liability rather than a quirk. At the same time, newer tanks were arriving in theater. American M4 Shermans were showing up in larger numbers, and they brought something the Matilda couldn't: speed, better crew comfort, easier maintenance, and standardized parts that were actually available. The Sherman's armor was lighter, yes, but against Japanese weapons, it was still more than adequate. And it could move at 30 miles per hour on roads, literally double the Matilda's top speed. Australian and British commanders started requesting Shermans to replace their Matildas. Not because the Matildas weren't effective, they still were, but because the operational flexibility that Shermans provided was becoming more valuable than the Matilda's superior armor. There's a memo from early 1945 where an Australian tank commander notes, "The Matilda is still the best tank for reducing fortified positions, but we're spending less time reducing fortified positions and more time pursuing a beaten enemy. For that, we need speed." Production had already ceased back in Britain in 1943. The factories had moved on to newer designs. The Matildas still in service were essentially irreplaceable. When one was destroyed or wore out, that was one fewer Matilda in theater. Shermans, meanwhile, were rolling off American lines in the thousands. Maintenance burden was also becoming unsustainable. By 1945, many Matildas had been in service for years in the harsh Pacific environment. They were worn out, parts were scarce, and keeping them operational required disproportionate effort. One Australian maintenance officer reported that a single Matilda needed 3 times the maintenance hours of a Sherman. The last major combat use of Matildas was during the Borneo campaign in mid-1945. They performed well, still invulnerable to Japanese weapons, but it was clearly their swan song. One of the final recorded combat actions was at Balikpapan in July 1945. A single Matilda supported infantry, absorbed multiple anti-tank hits, destroyed 3 bunkers, and withdrew to rearm. Classic Matilda performance. Slow, methodical, unstoppable. But it was one of the last times a Matilda would fire its gun in anger. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Matilda's war ended. The post-war world had no place for slow, obsolete infantry tanks. The Matilda's moment had passed. What happened to them afterward was somewhat tragic. Most were scrapped. Shipping them home cost too much. Many tanks that had survived countless battles ended up cut apart for steel. Some were used as target practice for post-war anti-tank weapons. An indignity, considering Japanese guns could barely scratch them. A 1946 weapon could punch through with ease. Technology had simply moved on. A few survived as training vehicles or museum pieces. The Australian War Memorial keeps a combat Matilda in jungle camouflage, still bearing impact marked from Japanese shells. Most, however, were lost to history. But the veterans never forgot. For them, the Matilda wasn't just a vehicle, it was what brought them home alive. In interviews decades later, they spoke of the heat, the discomfort, the breakdowns, the slowness, but also the invincibility, the security, the trust. One veteran said, "Hottest, most uncomfortable, slowest damn thing. But I love that tank. It saved my life more times than I can count." When they scrapped them, it felt like they were scrapping a piece of my soul. In the broader history of World War II, the Matilda's Pacific service is a footnote. Air and naval battles get the spotlight, while Pacific tank warfare is barely mentioned. But to the soldiers who used it, and to the Japanese who faced it, the Matilda was anything but a footnote. It was a game changer, a battle winner, a steel monster that refused to die. The Matilda arrived in the Pacific as an obsolete tank. It became a legend, and when its time was over, it simply faded away, replaced by newer machines. By 1950, there wasn't a single Matilda still in active service anywhere in the Pacific. A tank that had been nearly invincible just 5 years earlier was now extinct. But legends don't die, they change form. The Matilda lives on in stories, records, museums, and the memories of the men it protected. The jungle monster faded into history, but it never truly disappeared. All right, folks, we've reached the end of this journey through one of World War II's most fascinating and underrated stories. The Matilda II infantry tank, designed in the 1930s, obsolete by 1942, and absolutely dominant in the Pacific theater from 1942 to 1945. A tank that Japanese weapons literally could not penetrate, even at point-blank range. A tank that changed battles, saved lives, and terrified an entire enemy army. We've covered a lot of ground here, literally from the jungles of New Guinea to the islands of Borneo. We've talked about the design features that made the Matilda invincible, the battles where it turned the tide, the flaws that nearly undid its legend, and the quiet fade into history when its time had passed. But if you take away one thing from this video, it should be this: context matters. A weapon that's obsolete in one theater can be perfect in another. Technology isn't just about specs and numbers. It's about how well it matches the mission. And the Matilda, for all its limitations, was a perfect match for the Pacific War. It wasn't the fastest tank. It wasn't the most modern. It wasn't even the most comfortable to operate. Seriously, Those crews deserve medals just for surviving the heat. But when you needed a tank that could absorb punishment, destroy fortified positions, and bring its crew home safely, there was nothing better. The Japanese learned this the hard way. Their anti-tank weapons, perfectly adequate against Chinese and early war Allied armor, were useless against the Matilda. Their tactics, their fortifications, their entire defensive philosophy had to adapt to this threat they couldn't overcome. And for the Allied soldiers fighting in the Pacific, the Australian and British troops who crewed these tanks and fought alongside them, the Matilda was more than just a weapon. It was confidence. It was security. It was the knowledge that when things got desperate, when the defenses seemed impregnable, there was this steel monster that could smash through and make a path. The stories we've covered today, the battles, the crew experiences, the Japanese desperation, the mechanical struggles, these aren't just military history. They're human stories about people facing impossible situations and finding a way through. The Matilda was just a tool, but in the hands of brave crews and smart commanders, it became something more. So yeah, the Matilda wasn't perfect. It was slow, it broke down, it required constant maintenance, and it became obsolete again by 1945. But for 3 years in the Pacific Theater, it was exactly what was needed. An unstoppable fortress, a jungle juggernaut, a legend. And you know what? That's a pretty good legacy for a tank that was supposed to be a footnote in history. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into one of World War II's most fascinating tales. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe for more history content, and drop a comment letting me know what obscure historical topic you want to cover next. Maybe I'll do a video on the Bob Semple tank, New Zealand's magnificently terrible attempt at tank design. Or maybe we'll talk about the Soviet T-35, the tank equivalent of "we heard you like turrets, so we put turrets on your turrets." The possibilities are endless. Until next time, remember, sometimes the best weapon isn't the most advanced one. Sometimes it's just the one that shows up, does the job, and refuses to die no matter how hard the enemy tries. Stay curious, stay passionate about history, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.